Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those across Canada, North America, and around the world. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful Saturday to talk about the launch of a very exciting initiative and organization to deliver sustainable quality opportunities to Canadians in the aerospace sector. My name is Tahir Morali, the co-founder and director the Zenith Pathway Canada's organization. And our foundation is really excited to welcome you all today to talk about something really important, and that's the value of mentorship. So early career professionals here in Canada struggle to find opportunities to either discover new skills or kickstart their career in a field of their choice. They ultimately leave Canada to acquire the experience or inevitably immigrate to chase their dream. Now, companies here in Canada can't find talent in Canada to meet their immediate staffing and organizational needs. It's a common theme that has occurred with recommendations from government, academia, and industry over the last several decades. So a bunch of us came together to say, why don't we do something about it? And with the talent and future of Canada's aerospace sector here at a crossroads and perhaps being vulnerable, there's no better time than now to be able to take charge with the burgeoning space sector, not only here in Canada, but around the world, and solidify talent pipelines for Canadian talent. So today we're talking about the value of mentorship. And first off, I would like to thank the attendees, you, for giving up about an hour of your Saturday to come and listen to some of Canada's young professionals and rising stars to talk about their experience, not only in their sector and starting their career, but how they have grown it through the value of mentorship. I'd also like to thank our co-host, the Space Generation Advisory Council, for facilitating and providing a moderator and a panelist for today's event. But also I want to thank my team. The Zenith Canada Pathway Foundation is a voluntary organization and would not be where it is today without the kind and generous time donated by those volunteers, both in front of the cameras and behind the scenes, namely Hira, Kelsey, Brian, MG, Zed, and those as well behind the scenes in the shadows. So the Zenith Canada Pathways Foundation fills a large void in Canada's aerospace workforce pipeline. And we're driven to deliver a national merit-based professional training and career development program that bridges the knowledge and experience gaps between post-secondary education and early career work experience. And so we're looking forward to supporting and sustaining a highly qualified, diverse Canadian aerospace industry workforce by complementing that with current existing awareness and advocacy organizations, industry, academia, and government programs. And our flagship program, the Zenith Fellowship, is a trifecta of support offering, where we seek to strike an appropriate balance between meaningful work experience, senior level mentorship, and passionate leadership to best position its high-flying recipients for success. And the outcomes that we seek for the Zenith Fellowship, Canada's first space fellowship based on the successful models in the States with the Brooke Owens Fellowship, the Matthew Isaacowitz Fellowship, and the Patty Grace Smith Fellowship, we seek here in Canada to develop a bespoke national mentoring program that is both challenging for its recipients and provides tangible results for engaged partners. We also hope to create a reservoir of highly qualified personnel for the aerospace industry, and of course, promote the personal career development of professionals through skills and leadership. So thank you again for attending, and I'll now introduce Zed Rana, our moderator for today's panel. Now, Zed is a junior program scientist working on mission systems and instrument design. And at the SGAC, he acts as the national point of contact for Canada. He is passionate about space outreach and advocacy through his commitment in bridging the opportunity divide in the Canadian space sector. He joined the leadership team at the Zenith Canada Pathways Foundation as Director of External Relations, where he aspires to co-create a community of diverse leaders in Canada's aerospace industry. So Zed, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tahir, for that great introduction about Zenith. All right, let's get started. I'm Zed, and I'll be your moderator for this incredible panel. I'm based in Montreal, Canada, and I'd like to acknowledge that I am located on unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters. The event today is primarily in English. L'événement se déroulera en anglais, mais je vous invite quand même à poser vos questions en français. L'équipe à Zenith travaille fort pour s'assurer que les événements de futur se déroulent en bilingue, en anglais et en français. That being said, I'll kickstart with the introductions of our illustrious panelists. First up is Hira Nadeem. She is currently a graduate student in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at Western University, Institute of Earth and Space Exploration. She's a co-founder of the Zenith Canada Pathways Foundation and is a strong believer in making space accessible and interdisciplinary. Last year, Hira was selected as the first Canadian Brooke Owens Fellow with the opportunity to intern at Planet in San Francisco, California this past fall. Hira is also excited to research solutions to problems both on Earth and in space during her master's and looks forward to contributing to the Canadian space industry. Next up, we have Mary Grace M.G. Calney, who is an aerospace systems engineer on the business development team at Loft Orbital Solutions in San Francisco. As a systems engineer, MG evaluates a variety of mission concepts to determine their feasibility on board upcoming Loft missions and communicates directly to customers and implements their unique needs. Before joining Loft, MG interned at the Canadian Space Agency and was previously the project manager of CSA's Canadian CubeSat project, leading a team of 70 student members for a 3U Earth observation mission. Next up, we have Max King from Edmonton, Alberta. He's an engineer currently working on space exploration systems with MDA. Max completed his undergraduate degree in materials engineering from University of Alberta and is a candidate for Masters in Applied Science from the University of Toronto in aerospace engineering. With time spent abroad working with the German Aerospace Center, DLR, and here in Canada working on satellites and Canadarm2 with MDA, he wants to further Canada's leadership in the peaceful use of outer space. Last but not least, we have Mariam Nassim. She has a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from UT Austin and an MBA from the University of Toronto. She has a global and a multidisciplinary background, including working as a commercial space consultant, a stint as a field engineer on an oil rig in Russia, and as a business development manager for a quantum computing startup. Mariam enjoys utilizing her skills to bridge a gap between emerging technologies and business needs, creating value through project management, market analysis, and business development activities. In her free time, she volunteers at various nonprofits such as SGAC and SETS Canada. Now, considering the incredible experience and diversity of our panelists, I'll get started with a couple of questions. And the first one I'll ask to Mariam, and we'll go around the table to each panelist to get their input. Mariam, what kind of tools, resources, or guidance do you wish you had access to in Canada to realize the start of your space career?
Thanks for that question, Sid. So as you had mentioned in your introduction, my journey in the space sector happened after working in other industries, and it was fairly recent. It was in the last year or so. And I did feel like there was a bit of a black box around trying to enter the Canadian space sector from outside. I do believe there are a lot of opportunities, interesting organizations and roles that one can apply to, but knowing from the outset where those exist is challenging. So what I had to do was have a lot of conversations with people I didn't know, reaching out to them on LinkedIn, over email, trying to attend as many events as I could to start making those connections and building that network through my own initiative. I didn't see an organization or an initiative that already existed that would help facilitate that. So I think Zenith, with its fellowship program, is very well positioned to fill that gap for students and young professionals that are looking to enter the space sector, either already being in the sector, perhaps they're already studying in this, but they want to get into industry, or even individuals like myself who are young professionals working outside of the sector, but looking for a pathway to enter. this resource will be very critical and it will help a lot.
That's awesome, the power of networking and just to see your non-traditional background coming into space. All right, and how about yourself, MG?
Hi, so I definitely echo what Miriam said. I mean, my experience was different. I was in academia at the time when I started looking for opportunities in the space sector, but I experienced that same kind of disconnect or gap between the opportunities that were available and the alleged demand for aerospace engineers or for people to work in the industry, and all of these hardworking, passionate students who wanted to break in but didn't know how. So I think exactly as Miriam said, that Zenith is really going to fill that gap and provide transparency and exposure to what is in the industry and allow people to move their way through it. I think that's what's going to be most critical.
All right, yeah, there's definitely some commonality here. And how about yourself, Max?
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, so you listed like what tools, resources, or guidance would I want or wish I had access to when starting this career. Mostly just the guidance part of that, having a voice of someone 10 years down the road from me, of what did you study, what did you do, what work experience did you have. That was the big. Someone said it a few moments ago, black box going into university. I knew I want to do engineering. That's a pathway to working on spacecraft. And kind of the next step after that was completely unknown. Was it, 4 years of work? Who knew? So I think having some sort of guidance, like a mentorship program here, as we're all saying, that this is the big missing link for young professionals wanting to start a career in Canada, is having the ability to talk to someone, that network of people. And especially it's heavily biased, as Miriam said, having to reach out to people who you've never met and have to have a conversation with. That is a huge barrier to people who maybe aren't comfortable doing that, but have incredible skills to provide in this industry. But that's just an unnecessary filter. So having a program that you can apply to or be a part of that actually brings you into contact with those connections is essential.
Right on. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of similar sentiments being echoed about power of network and also communication, having someone guide you along and provide resources. Seems these are interconnected. And how about yourself, Hira? What are your takeaways on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is why it's so great to be on the stage with all these amazing people, is that we all want the same thing, is that we want this kind of a program. We want this type of mentorship and these opportunities for people who are going through the same stuff we went through not too long ago. But yeah, definitely, I completely echo the network, the mentorship. And as someone who just went through a similar program that we're trying to bring here in Canada, the Brooke Owens Fellowship, honestly, like, I was very lucky to have the opportunities I had in Canada. Much like Mariam, I, talked to people I didn't know, and I started programs that I wanted to see in my community at McMaster. But I think definitely, like, there's something very different about, a formal program where mentors are there for you, there's an expectation of how much time they're willing to put in and, meet with you consistently, as well as meeting a group of people who are your peer mentors and that you can rely on within your community. And and much like MG, Mariam, and Max, like, we have done that ourselves. But I think having that kind of formal program is exactly what we need to empower these students, especially students who, don't have the opportunities that I had myself, which was, the ability to go to conferences and, to take time off school to build my network, giving students who, work jobs part-time to make their way through school, who, could use that extra help in building that network when they may not have that opportunity. I think that's exactly, what we need to do.
Yeah, right on, and definitely some great points there in terms of not everyone has similar access to same resources or the capacities. There's certainly certain inequities to consider. So that's definitely highlighting a need for a concerted sort of platform that is able to mediate and bridge that gap. That being said, I also want to remind those that have tuned in that if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post as we go along. And at the end, we'll have a round of questions and answers. Moving on to the next question that I have is, have you benefited from a mentoring relationship, either formal or informal? And if so, how has it shaped your journey? And if not, what would have been your ideal mentorship? And I'll ask that, let's go ahead with Max.
Yeah, so definitely through my education, like incredible supports from family and other bosses and things. That was incredible to have, but the piece that was missing for me was specifically space-focused mentorship. And I can unfortunately point to a very brief email exchange in my first year with someone at the CSA as like a critical piece of mentorship that I had. And it was a friend of a friend of a friend who knew someone at the CSA that I could get in touch with. And their advice to me is something that I've heard other people repeat since. Their advice was, get into the space mafia. Like, you have to get in and meet the small community of Canadian space engineers, industry members, etc. It's growing, but it's not a burgeoning community. So the more people you know, those connections, that's how you can find a job. Outside of like that specific guidance, I would have, like I said before, loved to just have, maybe every 6 months, just a conversation with someone who'd been through kind of the crossroads decisions. Like, there are many paths to working in space, which isn't something I identified early on. Like, it takes mechanical engineers, software engineers, computer scientists, civil engineers. It takes everyone. It's not just, as I was sort of told in my undergrad, mechanical engineering, that's what you need to do to work in space, which then really hit hard when I didn't get into mechanical engineering. That felt like a lot of doors closed, but that's not the case at all. Space is for everyone and it takes everyone. Unfortunately, a place I started looking for mentorship, I guess, or like pathways, was reading astronaut bios. Okay, these are people who've made it into space, the space world. These are the most visible people. Okay, I need to become a fighter jet pilot, a doctor. Okay. This is long career path ahead of me. So, unfortunately, that's not the reality of how to work in space. And just having a space professional to talk to every even 6 months, just to check in of what decisions are coming up, grad school, summer jobs, research, like what pathways can I take here and now to develop my career?
Yeah, that's a great point about how it almost seems that you only have that access to this mentorship as after you've made it in the space sector, and rather not have it precede. You highlighted a couple of crossroads that might have benefited from a mentorship guiding and providing, maybe even enabling other opportunities that may not be apparent at first. Some great inputs there. And what are some of your thoughts on this point, Maria?
I love the points that Max highlighted already about having that person to talk to as you start your space journey. I think personally, I've been quite grateful in terms of the informal mentorship part. Throughout my experience in different companies, I've found what you can call sponsors and supporters in the form of my supervisors or bosses that I've worked with. And before joining the space sector, I was working at a Canadian bank, and it had nothing to do with space, but it's really funny. I felt like my supervisors could actually sense my interest in space through conversations or through events that were happening. And so one of my directors, he really encouraged that. When he found out that I was interested in space, he supported that, and we're in touch to this day. So he'll take the time to write me recommendation letters to show his support, because it hasn't always been a smooth journey, and there are ups and downs along the way. So if you have someone who's telling you, Miriam, this makes sense. I can tell you're interested in this. Sometimes you just need to hear someone else tell you something back that you already know, and that you should continue to pursue this path. Like it is something that you should continue to do. That really helped me. Another thing was when I started reaching out to some of the people initially in the space sector, I got connected to a professor in the US on the space law side, and I started volunteering to help with the launch of a governance lab over there. And I think through that activity of just volunteering, contributing my time, learning, I developed an informal mentorship relationship as well. And it was this individual that actually pointed out to me the first opportunity that I got in the space sector, which was on the consulting side. Because as Max had mentioned, I had this perception that you need to be an engineer or a scientist to be working in space. It wasn't until I started having a lot more conversations that I had to initiate on my own that I learned that it truly we have this new space economy forming where you need the business development folks, you need the marketing people, you need someone with my skills as well. Because I was coming at it not from my engineering background, because I have an undergrad in engineering, but after my MBA, looking at it from a business development, project management aspect. And I wasn't sure if there was a place for someone with my skills, but I realized that not to be the case. However, it did require a lot of legwork, introspection, and conversations to get there. So to the second point then of having formal mentorship, I only realized that programs like that existed more recently. So I would want to highlight a few of them. One of them is the UNOSA Space for Women Network Mentorship Program. This is really great for women who are looking to advance their careers in the space sector. You sign up, you get assigned a mentor, and as Max said, you have a regular cadence. So you meet up. It depends on the mentor's initiative, but my mentor, for example, we connect every month and we have a one-on-one chat, and I found that really helpful. Another program is through the SJAC, which I represent along with Zed in Canada. They also have an amazing mentorship program that I would highly recommend anyone from the ages of 18 to 35, students or young professionals, to sign up for. And this is open to everyone. So please do check it out if you're interested in getting involved in the sector. And it has a great matching process as well. And that would provide you with one of those avenues for formal mentorship.
Yeah, that's definitely a very interesting point about how space is so multifaceted, but it took so many layers of conversations and communication. And it highlights, again, it accentuates that point about having this anchor person that is able to be a bit of that a narrator that allows you and gives some inputs and perhaps some feedback, but also as some of you have highlighted, a attentive listener, and in making sure that you are redirected where the core of your passion or interest are. And these are some interesting points. And how would you echo with what has been said already, Hira?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is definitely something that's very shared amongst us all with the informal mentorship part. Myself, starting out in second year, looking at space industry as a potential career, I didn't even look at it as a career, even though I was in electrical engineering, because for some reason I was like, oh, the space industry doesn't need electrical engineers. Like, unless you're an aerospace engineer, like, what are you going to do in space? But that was a very, immature mindset, because I was so young at the time and I hadn't seen people like myself in electrical engineering publicly. It's, again, like Max said, it's all a lot of astronauts, especially that are highlighted. So I kind of came from it from an outreach perspective, because I thought, oh, well, if I can't do space and I really love space, why don't I encourage other people to get into space? Because I want to help, I want to help that initiative somehow. And it was through that just kind of, outreach aspect that I learned more about it. But that was the key, really. It was the outreach, is that I connected with Kate Howells from the Planetary Society after seeing her at a conference, and she was talking about how there's chapters of the Planetary Society around the world. And I was like, whoa, like, is there one in Hamilton? Because I'm in Hamilton and I don't see any. So she was like encouraging me to start a club at my school. And through that, I still think of her as a mentor of mine, even though she wasn't formally someone who did that. But her encouragement and guidance and her willingness to support me and like help me run these cute events like an asteroid day presentation about planetary defense, things like that when I was starting out, was so instrumental in me like continuing to pursue space and see that as a career path. Because without that encouragement, I might have fallen off. And like Mariam, from a non-space background doing work and things. I was in transmission. I was at a transmission company as my first co-op, and I thought to myself, okay, well, I guess this is my career. Like, I'm going to just do this now because I can't do space. But because of that encouragement of that network and that, knowing that, I can still do space, I could try, I continued with it, and I, worked hard, and I connected with people at a conference, and that's where I met Thomas Sears from Sinclair Interplanetary. And he was like, we need electrical engineers. Like, what are you talking about? Like, we have all aerospace. We need electrical people. And so he took a chance and hired me on for the summer as an intern. That was the pivoting point. So from there, I think it's so important, just like everyone has said, is that like that person to give you guidance, to like validate what you're thinking and to encourage you and to push you along. It's so important. And I was so fortunate through Brooke Owens to have a formal mentor for a year who I checked on, or was checking on me, and we touch base every month or so, was really important. And I encourage anyone who, doesn't have a formal mentor to, just like Mariam was saying, reach out, look for these kind of programs. Zenith is on the way. We're gonna bring one, but don't be afraid to reach out to someone that you are inspired by. The worst that they'll say is, I'm sorry, I don't really have time. But I'm sure anyone here on this panel, Zed and Tahir included, would love to talk to you and help you along. And I'm sure there's many people in this industry who would as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting how you put it, in terms of how initially your academic background was seen as perhaps not conventional or not suitable to space, and you switched it around. You made what was essentially initially a barrier, and you approached it, well, let me create a potential solution, and that solution even pivoted you towards a whole different aspect, which is science communication and whatnot. So that is definitely interesting, and it's great to hear Zenith mentorship being a core aspect of the program that is up and coming, as well as some of the programs highlighted by Mariam across SGAC and UNUSA. That being said, MG, what are some of your takeaways on that point and what has been mentioned already?
Yeah, so my experience with mentorship leading up to breaking into the space industry has been a little different, I think, than the other panelists, in that I can't necessarily point to one particular person that was really that guiding light, but rather it was a network of a lot of like everyday heroes, a lot of people with diverse backgrounds, a lot of them even peers, I'd say, that have been able to mentor me. And I think that's such a important thing to think about in mentorship, that it should be, as Max mentioned, continuous. This should be something that you're regularly following up on. And also, I think it should be diverse. It can come from anybody. It doesn't always have to be someone who's well into their career and has it all figured out. I think you can get really, really valuable advice and mentorship from people who are like one step ahead of you in their journey, or even on the same page or behind. Like, there are really lessons that you can learn from everybody. And so that was the mentoring relationship that I had that was most informative and most helpful for me. Like, I can point to my experiences, for instance, on Space Concordia's team. We were a group of students who none of us had formal training in the aerospace industry. We all just loved space and loved spending every moment of our time together working on it, or all of our free time working on it. And so I'd say, actually, just being around people that are interested in space, you all kind of learn about different areas and different opportunities, and you can share that with each other. That was through that network of my peers that I learned about conference opportunities. I learned about how do you get an internship in the industry. And so those sorts of relationships, that sort of advice was exactly what I was looking for, and maybe in my mind thought would come from some particular mentor in the industry. But in reality, I think it can be found just in your peer group. And so that's one thing that I'm super excited about the Zenith Fellowship, and the idea of fellowships in general, is that you can learn and get that advice from people at all stages of their career, and really see and hear different advice, the variety there and different inputs. So yeah, 100% mentorship is so key, and I'm excited to see how that grows with Zenith.
Yeah, that's very exciting, and great shout out to Space Concordia. It's definitely interesting that you brought up this peer sort of collective group of like-minded people that share a common passion, that there might be strength in finding a common group of people with same interests, and then the collective minds, then, obviously there's some creativity. And as you highlighted, you eventually come across with someone perhaps bringing in a conference that could be attended, and perhaps a conference that could be attended by the peers as well within the group. So that's an interesting point. Moving on to the next question, throughout these conversations, most of you have covered quite a bit of that, but I would still be curious to find if you can distill down, in terms of generally speaking, what do you think are some of the most prominent entry barriers to the space sector today? And to quickly follow up on that, are there any specific ones that come to mind for the Canadian space sector? And I'll ask that with starting with you, Hira.
Yeah, this is actually very relevant because my own younger sister is also very interested in working in the space industry, and we were just trying to apply for co-ops with her. And I've had many friends who have been trying to apply for jobs as new graduates, and especially during this time with the difficulties with COVID. But I think what really I find is a difficult a barrier is just knowing about opportunities and like the access to those opportunities and knowing where to find them. I mean, there's so many companies popping up. There's so many different companies that do aerospace without really explicitly stating that they do aerospace. And it's been a very interesting learning opportunity to find that out. And I think myself, one thing that was really cool through Brooke Owens was, as an international student who has many barriers to working in the US space industry because of ITAR, I didn't know what companies would take Canadian students, and it was like eye-opening to me to have this list on their website where it clearly states, US only, permanent resident, or international. And I had no idea about companies like Planet that could take international students and that did the work to make sure that they could take international people to work on their projects. So that database where, it shows all these companies that work with Brooke Owens, and then all these companies that, they take these types of specializations and this type of requirement for citizenship, I feel like is missing a bit in Canada, even though a lot of people are trying to do those types of things with job boards and, aggregating that information, but it's still quite, disconnected. And it's just like, where are these opportunities and how do people know about it? Is it just, I find out about it right before the deadline and I apply? So yeah, I think that's like a big issue that I'm seeing. And unless you know someone who knows someone who knows someone who works there, it can be very difficult.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And we're starting to see how these interconnections between who do you know, if you have a regular cadence of conversation with someone that is able to provide some sort of guidance, and at the same time, some aspects pertaining to resources that were highlighted. And sometimes, for certain students or even early career young professionals, learning about these regulatory export limitations such as ITAR, and with respect to the possibility that it is not a blanket sort of restriction across every opportunity. And perhaps there are some in the US that don't require these kind of stringent requirements. And I think it's interesting that you highlighted that if there is some information that makes that accessible, that in itself provides some form of pathway, for lack of a better word. Great point. And what about yourself, Max? How would you echo along with what has been said along the lines so far?
Yeah, the sort of data bank that Hira mentioned of like a list of companies, the Government of Canada website does have a list of companies that are involved in the space sector. And I only found about that, when I already had my job in the space sector, which is a little bit moot. But certainly I'm not sure even how up to date it is, but something like what Hira described, like, an organized database of these are the skills of people we're looking for. I think the government's trying to build that on their website, but I think that's, again, something that Zenith can bring into this environment, somewhere where students can go to not only go to find an answer they're kind of looking for, but as a place to explore. Like, okay, I see software engineer pops up a lot. Never thought about being able to be a software engineer and working in the space sector. So kind of like being able to see the opportunities, or like what opportunities are available, rather than like looking with a microscope for which ones can I directly apply to right now. So I think that's a barrier in Canadian space. It's been mentioned a few times, moving internationally to seek some form of job or internship like that. I was very fortunate to have an internship at the DLR, the German Space Agency, and that was huge for just throwing me into the space environment. I was coming from Edmonton, where there is an aerospace history out in the prairies with aircraft and fighter jets, but there isn't a big space presence. So being able to go to Germany was something I had the great fortune to be able to afford in general. I had a grant, but even without the grant, it would have been possible for me to do, which is a huge barrier in terms of equity of who can actually afford these opportunities. So that's something I was very happy to have. And I wasn't able to ever have an internship or job experience out here in Ontario, where most of the sector is maintained. Hopefully that's in the future that expands. But needing to move internationally for experience was something that it helped me incredibly. I don't want that to be the standard. That shouldn't be a requirement for students entering this sector in Canada, because like we said, that's a huge barrier. And knowing where to apply, contractors, I think it was Mary M or maybe Mary Grace said it, but there's lots of contractors who do space work, but you don't know that that's something they're involved in. There's enormous companies like Jacobs Engineering does have aerospace elements to it, which you wouldn't know from their presence where I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. But yeah, a database of companies is something that would be huge for helping, and also more internship opportunities at even the Canadian Space Agency. I know that's like, a drop in the bucket in comparison of how many people are interested in this field in Canada, but those are small steps that I think the government can at least do to help promote more space education.
Yeah, right. Spot on. There's a couple of interesting points there with respect to regional variation. And you've also highlighted something about how space, the identity of space, and perhaps the expanding the definition of what it means to be working in the space sector. And I think that's quite an interesting point brought forward. And what are some of your takes on that, MG?
Yeah, so I think as has been highlighted so far by Hira and Max, that there's a lot of different barriers to entry. And I think an important part is recognizing that there's an intersectionality between those, right? So you can imagine people living in parts of Canada where they don't view the space industry as something that's locally an opportunity to them, and perhaps don't have the education, the formal aerospace engineering programs that are advertised as, your pathway to get into the space industry. And so there's a lot of different barriers that when they all come together can really seem insurmountable for so many people. And I know even as myself as a woman, that not being something that I saw a lot of in aerospace in Canada, it was that made it just, that one bit harder to picture myself and think that I could have a place in the industry. But in particular, one of the things I want to say for anybody that's in the audience and is looking into the space industry, one of the biggest barriers to entry that I found was kind of the gatekeeping in language, which I think is pretty prominent in any like highly academic or rigorous field, where there's a lot of terms that you do have to learn, right? But those shouldn't be things that you have to learn in an engineering class, or, oh my goodness, the acronyms in the space industry. I know we all know they're ridiculous. There's ones for everything. There's acronyms built into other acronyms. So just for anybody that's out there, recognizing that those are languages that now that, even I can see for myself that I've learned, you kind of forget that that's a barrier, that's something you had to overcome. And it's certainly not something that's a make or break deal. Like, these are things that you can learn. And again, I think that's the importance of finding mentors or gaining experience, is that there's people will use language to try to gatekeep and show that you don't have the knowledge or capacity to make your way in the industry, when that's absolutely not true. Those are things that you can learn and you will learn and practice as you go. So that's just one that I would bring up.
That is such an interesting point that you bring up in terms of first representation, which obviously is something where often what you can be, what you don't see, perhaps, but also the ability of how language and the fact that it creates these silos, or it rather creates a sense of a very, for lack of a better word, a privileged group. A more specialized group that creates these barriers to access, where you are expected to be sort of familiar with the terminology and be in the know-how of what's within the space community, and sort of have a bit of already some pre-existing knowledge base, and that is certainly adding to that divide for accessing opportunity. These are some great points, and as a matter of fact, this conversation is quite interesting, because this takes me to the last question before we head off to the questions and answers from the audience. Is that in Canada, for example, opportunities, and as it was mentioned earlier from Max as well and across the panel, that primarily the space industry is sort of aggregated in Ontario and Quebec, with some sparse distribution in the rest of the country. And in some senses, sort of going to what MG you echoed with the power of words and language, there's a bit of an analogous representation that could be made perhaps with the digital divide, how connectivity and infrastructure has shown to, especially with COVID and pandemic, how it is showing some glaring inequities. And along these lines, some have also proposed to review systemic equity by taking a deeper look at current inequities that come and impact opportunities, which have been echoed to a point across the panel. So the question here that I have for each one of you is, what do you think can be done by the space industry to empower commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion? And let's start that with you, Hira.
Oh, yeah, big question for sure. Honestly, I think like where we're starting is just like talking about it, openly having conversations about it is where we can start, and, talking about the things that we have trouble talking about. Honestly, I am also searching for the solution, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with the rest of these panelists about it, and Canadians to learn more about how we can at Zenith serve everyone equally as best we can. But yeah, I think it starts with having a conversation and openly finding solutions together, and talking to the people who are dealing with those inequities on the other side, and getting their perspectives and learning how we can best serve them, for sure. But yeah, I would definitely want to hear more from everyone else.
Yeah, some great points here as well. What about yourself, Max? Some insights? I know you mentioned some of that aspect growing up in Edmonton, and that kind of sort of distribution of how there was pretty much no presence for, or at least there was no impression that there was any form of space activities.
Mm-hmm. I think certainly equity, diversity, inclusion, EDI across all STEM fields is something that needs to be focused on in the coming decades to help improve that. I'm on a federal council a youth council to the Chief Science Advisor of Canada, and that's a topic we are constantly bringing up. This is one of the big challenges moving forward to continue uplifting all of Canada, every Canadian, into these sectors. And of course, my personal passions are for space. Now, I am someone who has faced geography has been perhaps the only barrier I have faced in my space career. I cannot say I've been ever excluded in any sense. I think I've always had role models in the fields that I've been searching for. So that's not something I can directly relate to. I think having a different look of how our education system, particularly like STEM fields, provides employment or provides skills for employment. I know a few people on this panel we've talked about being involved in extracurricular activities, design teams and things like that, which are huge and have been, I think, highlighted by employers as these are skills we want to have. Now, that involves you having to have a large amount of free time outside of your education. And so if you want to be developing the skills in those, your schooling should be developing those skills for you. You shouldn't have to volunteer your time outside of school, especially if you have to take care of family members or have a job to pay for your schooling. You shouldn't be restricted from those activities that employers identify as helpful. I did have a friend who in school who had to step away from a design project he was passionate about for family purposes. And that changed the direction of his last 2 years of his education. And I think can impact employability after school, which I think that all feeds into equity, diversity, inclusion. How do we uplift every Canadian that wants to be involved in these programs? Also, another thing that a lot of us here have highlighted, university education for engineering in particular, trades programs. There's lots of other opportunities beyond sort of stereotypically like university as pathways to enter space. So I never want people to think that that's the barrier you have to get over. There are employment opportunities in space sectors for any type of education. So I'm very interested to hear, from Miriam and Mary Grace on this.
Right on. There's some interesting points that you raised there, how beyond sort of amplifying on that sparse geographic distribution with respect to whether an opportunity within space is accessible, you mentioned some elements that are compounded, how the education system itself perhaps is not adequately or not ensuring to provide these resources from the get-go. Not every community has perhaps a location where such student projects or extracurricular activities could be found. And of course, the fact that our personal narratives are so different and they bring their own dynamics, from whether it is from a health perspective, from things that might be going on in our personal lives and whatnot. Definitely all of that seeps into it. And as you've highlighted with your friend, these are some of the sequence of events that can have permanent repercussions and will drive away, unfortunately, some certain individuals from pursuing further those dreams and ambitions, perhaps. And it's certainly a key point to focus in a more comprehensive manner when looking at inequities and thinking about the people and the people aspect in their lives. So these are some interesting points, and I'm very curious to see some of your own inputs, MG, and perhaps if you echo along and if you have your own experience to share in regards to that.
Yeah, I think honestly speaking, coming from, I was very fortunate to be in Ontario and Quebec for my education, where the aerospace industry was more prevalent, that I feel very fortunate to have had at least that representation in the localities that I was. But certainly I think there is work that can be done. And for example, like the Canadian Space Agency's Canadian CubeSat project, where I don't think necessarily that it's the full solution, a complete solution in the end to provide projects to every single province and territory by, say, quota. But certainly I've seen the impacts that this has for those communities that otherwise wouldn't have had the experiences, and they're incredible. I mean, there's no reason that students outside of aerospace programs can't build and design CubeSats. There are skills that you learn in all sorts of programs. And I think that's really been highlighted by that initiative from the Canadian Space Agency.
Yeah, definitely. Then that you brought on something very interesting with CubeSats, and there has been a lot of conversation in terms of linking CubeSats to democratization of space. And of course, as you've highlighted, MG, yourself, the Canadian CubeSat project is truly a Canadian initiative spanning across all territory and provinces in Canada. And we're finding these over the course of these recent years, students and they had formed their own internet network. And interestingly enough, sort of echoing back to what you mentioned at some point about language and the acronyms and whatnot, you see the student community forming as they're building CubeSats that are looking at these challenges or trying to find some of those unknowns, whether technical or sometimes not even technical. They can be soft skills, leadership, team building, having the ability to distill what is needed for the project, and just generally speaking, for those that are project managers, perhaps they might be able to identify with this aspect better to fine tune the needs of those within your team. So that's certainly an interesting highlight that you mentioned, and something that perhaps not only the private sector, but also certainly an initiative that could come across from the public sector and the government, in this case, the Canadian CubeSat project being an initiative by the Canadian Space Agency. Miriam, some of your insights and takeaways on what has been mentioned so far?
I have to echo all the amazing points that the other panelists have made. Myself, I've worked in the technology sector in Ontario and then in Quebec in the aerospace sector. I do recognize that opportunities seem to be concentrated in these regions and that there is a lack of accessibility to opportunities in other regions. I agree with Tara's point that the first part needs to be around having spaces where these conversations continue to happen and we promote awareness around this issue so that there's constant discussion and dialogue and we come together to think about ways to brainstorm solutions and provide opportunities to people from other regions in Canada who want to take part in this sector. The other point is I firmly believe it's going to be a multi-stakeholder initiative. So we'll need support from the government, from nonprofit organizations, from industry to come together to start addressing this gap, because I think it was Max who said earlier, there's so many people who are excited and working in this sector. It's a problem of like providing information on opportunities that exist and sort of being that matchmaker which connects the talent to the opportunity. There's also the piece about creating more opportunities in general, but it's going to happen step by step. I think that Zenith is in a very unique position where it could play that role potentially by highlighting this issue in continued conversations and also working with other stakeholders to perhaps have scholarships or specific programs that are addressed to people from those regions to continue to provide them additional opportunities and platforms where they can get workforce development opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. These are some great highlights and some great insights across our different panelists. And I definitely seems to see some variation in terms of how the narrative and in terms of education and in terms of, who should it fall on to kind of tackle this sort of reframing how space can be made more accessible. And it turns out that it's not just perhaps just the space sector. It could be the education sector, professors on a more smaller level, but also government programs perhaps, and going towards in a community setting. There could be community centers that could be also dedicated in amplifying these opportunities and ensuring that they have the best visibility across to everyone, and especially to those that might not be able to benefit from these resources, or individuals, or depending on geographic variances with respect to opportunities. Now, that being said, there were some great insights that have been highlighted across. We do have a couple of questions, some interesting questions, and I'll dive straight into it by asking the first one. And I think this would be something that would be very much along your core area of based on your experience, Miriam, is what do you see for people that don't have any technical background within aerospace? For example, people that are not necessarily engineers, scientists, and managers on space projects, or kind of familiar background that is typically seen in space. and that want to contribute. Is there a space for them?
Of course, I love this question, Zed. It resonates with me very personally. I do not have an academic background in aerospace engineering, and I had to sort of make that space for myself initially. It was a lot of discovery. It was a lot of figuring out that, in fact, there are so many facets to this sector. And that's something I try to get across as well in a personal capacity through social media and otherwise. I try to share the opportunities that exist in, say, space law. If you're interested in like space law and policy, there's opportunities in marketing and like business design, business development, sales. It's so exciting. There's so much happening in this sector. There's like the venture capital interest. So a lot of people who might be interested in finance could join these venture capital investment firms to then invest in the startup economy that's emerging in the space sector. So there's a wide breadth of opportunities. And honestly, it's a bit unfortunate that you have to be following the right people or know the right organizations to find out about these opportunities. But once you sort of have your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the sector, you start seeing all these interesting things coming up that aren't just engineering or technical roles. And I'm always happy, like personally, if anyone wants to reach out to me directly, I'm always happy to point them to these interesting opportunities and the different things that might be available to them based on their skill set. And the point that I would like to get across along the way, they positioned me for joining the sector eventually in a consulting role. So what I did was draw on a little bit of my analytical skills, but then also my business background to help companies and space agencies with strategic economic financial projects. And until a year ago, I didn't even know that there was a role that existed that's called space consultant, but it did exist, you know? So do not think that there is not a space for you. There is. And the second thing is, if you don't think there is, there's nothing stopping you from trying to make your own space. Like it's not for everyone, but entrepreneurship and creating your own practice around what you want to do, what you think your future contribution could be, is also an option.
Yeah, definitely. And these are some great pointers. And while something that is interesting across this point is perhaps while even having access to a technical background, MG, as you highlighted previously, the vocabulary, the language we choose, even though you came from a background in terms of education that is based in science, particularly in physics, you've still seen the sort of lack of what could truly be done, and perhaps in terms of what does it look like to be part of a space sector, what kind of representation that entails. Is it scientists, engineers? And sort of curious about your take about how words and some of those acronyms that you were mentioning earlier could hinder that vision of what it looks like to be in space, and it doesn't have to be scientists or engineers. And perhaps do you have some thoughts on that, Menji?
Certainly. So yeah, as you mentioned, my background isn't in aerospace engineering either. I got my bachelor's in physics and computer science, and at the time really had no real direction or no clear decision to be in the space industry. So during my first undergraduate, it was unclear to me. I wasn't learning the terms. I wasn't developing the language that I needed. I had no idea what a CubeSat was. It really started when I did make a decision to go back and start a second undergraduate degree in aerospace engineering, particularly because, as we mentioned, that was the narrative that I understood to work. Once I had decided I wanted to work in the space industry, I said, okay, they're all aerospace engineers. We'll go try this out. Unfortunately, I found that was not the case. I didn't end up completing my second undergraduate degree because I found opportunities where I could leverage that scientific background that I had without necessarily needing to be an aerospace engineer. And so certainly there are so many paths. There are no wrong paths to get to the space industry, no matter how long it takes you, how windy it is. You can certainly do it. And while having a technical background does help, because there are a lot of technical language, there's a lot of technical language that we use every day, that's certainly not something that you can't learn or pick up on the job. I've seen and worked with people from all kinds of backgrounds. I work on a business development team where my manager is not from a technical background, has more of a fine arts background, and that's certainly not something that prevents us from doing our jobs. It can actually be a strength to have those different perspectives. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, definitely. These are some great points about, spinning. To complement what Miriam has said, and if you sort of spin that the other way around, is even if you do have perhaps technical background, you can see how that finds its way into a non-technical field, and frankly, that kind of we're starting to see this this sort of divide between technical, non-technical to become more to be more converging. And it's a seamless integration, and it requires communication across the board. Everyone needs to be working, as you highlighted, Mary Grace yourself, with respect to business development, which can entail multiple aspects and whatnot. All right, so now we have another question, which is quite an interesting one. And I'll ask you, Hira, is that will Zenith provide opportunities for young professionals that are not currently students, but are working in a different sector, so perhaps not even in the space sector, and that are also not necessarily student right now?
Yes, so that is the current goal. As you know, that Zenith is currently in development. We're still working out all of our requirements and our process and how we're gonna, bridge the gap between jobs and potential fellows. But we are trying to do that. We are trying to fill that gap between the early professional, new graduate end of it. But yeah, whether it's through either an internship, whether it's through, just mentorship, whether it's through some kind of other experience, we want to make sure that we're being cognizant of the new graduate, the people who are recently graduating, who do not fall under different requirements with co-op, that we can easily get them jobs. I think the goal is that Zenith will be for early professionals, whether they're students right now or entering the industry, in whatever way that we can support them. That's what we will try to do. And again, we are taking inputs from Canadians who have more experience on the side with finding jobs for new graduate students. And if you have any ideas on how we can best do this and integrate this into our program, please let us know, email us. But yeah, we want to do what we can to support them, whether through a job, whether through an opportunity, whether through mentorship, whatever we can do.
Definitely, it's a great point, and good to know that this is well within consideration for Zenith, and that the organization is reflecting on these questions and ensuring as we go along that there are enough measures in place to ensure that there are opportunities for practically everyone. The next set of questions that I have is, I'll redirect this one to you as well, Hira, is can you clarify what do you mean by passionate leadership? And this is referencing to one of the 3 key objectives that are highlighted for the Zenith Fellowship Program. And I think it is also something that is displayed on our website and whatnot. Do you have any sort of inputs and added clarification to that?
Sure, yeah. So for anyone who hasn't seen our trifecta, our triangle of what Zenith Fellowship wants to bring, which is the work experience, the senior level mentorship, and the passionate leadership, we highlight that because for us, the sense of, these people, Zed, myself, Tahir, and our volunteers, MG, even Mariam as our advisor, we are leading this effort. And I think that kind of that passion needs to distill into every part of this program. So that's where we highlight it as I've benefited from the Brooke Owens Network, seeing Will Pomerantz, Lori Garver, and Cassie Lee as the co-founders, the leadership team. And as that has grown into Deanna Trujillo and Kayla and Caroline, that passion has bled down into the fellowship and inspired and pushed forward that network. And even the fellowship classes, as they are becoming leaders in their own areas within the fellowship, outside the fellowship, that's what we want to push, is that community of these passionate leaders within Canada. We want to do that within our fellowship, within our organization at every level. I think that's very key for us.
Absolutely, right on. And there's our last question, which is quite an interesting one, and I'll preface this one and ask redirect this to you, Max. And I know that in our conversations, you've highlighted a few times how now that you are at MDA, you're benefiting to this wide network of individuals that are also morphing into a bit of a role of a mentor. So perhaps we step back and took it a few layers before getting to the point where you are. What advice can you provide to not feel overwhelmed to others that might be starting to taking steps towards being a leader or a mentor in the future? So perhaps even a bit to echo some of the experiences from Hira, how she ventured into science communication with the Planetary Society. I'm very curious to hear about your own take, Max, on that point.
Yeah, that's a key word there, how to not get overwhelmed, because we all are passionate about the things our day jobs or whatever gets us through, especially during COVID. But people want to be involved in space mentorship in some way. And I encourage anyone who's out there, I started with volunteering at my science center. That was sort of what started my science outreach journey, and which has led to a lot of mentorship that I have done or have been able to somewhat do. That's obviously not the best way to do it now with social distancing, but I encourage people to share their own story and experience through social media. Everyone who is going in the direction of a space career, or as I think the person who framed this question asked, early in their space career, wanting to do mentorship in some way, share your story. Whatever experience you have, you're a data point of someone who has gotten through education system, whatever, and you're in a job that you hopefully want to be at, in the sector you want to be at least. And it's not you've reached the finish line kind of thing. It's where are you going? What unknowns are you still facing? And that's something that I think I have a direction now that I'm in the space sector of where I see myself going within it. As Mary said, it becomes a lot broader once you're on the inside. You see it as much more massive than it looks from the outside, much more diverse. And I encourage people to share their story on social media if they can, connect with people. An easy way to do it is your high school. I've been in contact with my high school before, and just talking with one or two students every so often, being like, hey, if you're interested in this, these are good starting points to go for. So I would say reach out to high school. If you reach out to your former university, maybe you've passed undergraduate as well. That can be a lot broader. Sometimes that opens up the door. If you have more bandwidth, you can try that. But I found starting with reaching out to my high school teachers and saying, hey, if you have students who want a career in space, I've been pushing for that for the last 8 years. I've learned a thing or two. And someone else mentioned this before, like, it's good to talk to people who are early in their careers. Like, you don't want to get house buying advice from your grandparents. Like, it's fairly removed if you're talking to someone who's, retiring in a month, like what their space journey was. That's interesting and that is valuable, but it doesn't necessarily apply to the decisions you have to make in undergraduate, or if you want to do a master's degree. I've learned from people who I work with now, I thought I needed a master's degree to work in space. I have learned by working next to people who do not have that experience, who are younger than me, who have very similar job. And that's eye-opening. And I think everyone should share that information. If they have whatever your experience is, you should share it.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. And I'm kind of interested in trying to sneak one last question. And I'll redirect this one to you, Hira. And the question essentially is, how important would you say it is to get international as well as Canadian students to become involved in the fellowship program. So perhaps maybe you can elaborate a bit about the initial scope of the fellowship that is currently being designed, and would that someday expand on to international students?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so currently we are looking at our eligibility for Canadian citizens, people who are authorized to work in Canada. Obviously, we want to make that process more accessible, and we are also considering how we can do that for international students. So it's nothing is set in stone quite yet on this first iteration, but that's our current target. As someone who was a part of the Brooke Owens Network as an international student, I can see the complete necessity to bring people from around the world to contribute to the Canadian space industry as well. The only way we move forward is through global collaboration, and I'm so passionate about that. I want to bring that, and I'm sure everyone on this team and here is as well. So we are definitely going to try to see, but that doesn't mean that we won't have opportunities. If it's not a job, again, we're going to try to make ways to engage people from all backgrounds, from all over Canada, from abroad as well, however way we can within the program, whether that is through, a summit, a workshop, or, an opportunity, a mentorship, something. Definitely reach out to us if that's something that is your struggle. And if you don't fit into the whatever we're doing with our program, we will try to make space. Like that's the goal. So yeah, we're still developing. That's the short of it.
Wonderful. And right before I pass on to Tahir for some closing remarks, I just want to echo very briefly some of the wonderful perspectives that have been provided by different panelists. And what is really interesting is that ultimately, when you distill these things down, is where we've seen across our panelists how technical elements can be sort of shifted the other way around, and barriers to access can easily fluctuate across both realms. We've seen the power of words, inequities in terms of sparse distribution of where opportunities are, but also the individual narratives of each one of us, and how that can also seep into our ability to pursue our ambitions and dreams. Various panelists have highlighted how they've learned to morph how they initially found a solution to a challenge, where ultimately it boiled down to, let me create a solution and have others join and be part of that. And it seems that, or rather what is the sentiment that has been echoed all across the board is certainly everyone has found or done something to create something new. And I think that process of creation, that ideation that goes into building something that is not existing, or at least that cannot be emulated, is very interesting, and certainly highlights equally the philosophy behind Zenith as well. Is that if there is something that comes across someone's mind, bring forward to the table, and we're all here to concretize and bring that thing to reality. If it's not here, why not? That being said, I'll hand over to our wonderful co-founder, Tahir, and for some closing remarks and some key highlights.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Zed, for being able to extract some wonderful thoughts and opinions from our fantastic panel. Thank you, Zed. Thank you, MG. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Miriam. And thank you, Hira. What a wonderful discussion today on a great Saturday afternoon, to be able to just provide insight and digest and think about not only where you have come in your careers, but how you can help others that are coming after you continue on that path, and as you target to grow in the sector and become leaders in your own right. So that's wonderful. So thank you very much for sharing some of those thoughts. And thank you, of course, to the audience. Your questions were fantastic. And we had so many of them that we're actually going to set up an FAQ page on our page to address some key points that you've addressed, such that we can effectively address your questions. So keep an eye out on our website for that coming in the future. But also I want to thank those that are in attendance, whether they're from industry, academia, government. We are here to work with you to be able to execute and deliver the Zenith Fellowship. Again, something very, very unique to Canada, modeled on some successful models from the US, and it really will support to fill a void in Canada's aerospace workforce pipeline. So we do sincerely look forward to working with you. And to that end, whether you are considering becoming a host organization or even joining us as a strategic partner in some capacities, we're certainly open to having those discussions and looking forward to having you join the Zenith family. That also goes for volunteers. As you know, we're all volunteers here, and it's certainly not something we can do alone. So if you have an interest in being able to see this vision be concretized and build a really sustainable future for Canada's aerospace sector, please drop us a line. We look forward to speaking with you and see how you might be able to help us deliver our vision. In terms of the fellowship itself, there's a number of priorities, of course, that we seek to deliver. And two of those, of course, as we know, Canada being the great diverse nation that it is, from Victoria to St. John's, Newfoundland, we are located all across this great nation from the north right down to the south. And that allows us, we aim and strive to be equitable, diverse, and inclusive, not only in geography, but also in background. And so we look forward to be able to deliver that and deliver opportunities for students and young professionals across our great nation to engage and build a really successful sector here in Canada. Additionally, one of the things we really value is compensated work experience. So for those host organizations that are out there, one of our key priorities is ensuring that talent in this country is fairly compensated. And that is one of the key pillars of some of the opportunities that we will look to facilitate, being able to democratize access to the sector via paid work experience. So with no further ado, thank you very much again. For any further questions or queries, please feel free to go to our website, www.zenithpathways.ca, or as well drop us an email at info@zenithorg.ca. Thank you very much for your time today, and thank you all panelists again for your wonderful discussion. Have a great weekend.